Next year, Britain will celebrate the Platinum Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth, who will become the first British monarch to mark 70 years on the throne. Officials are planning a 4-day celebration complete with a grand parade, a pageant, and a platinum party at the palace that will feature performances by many famous names. Of course, the Brits, our cousins across the pond, have been in love with their monarchy for a very long time. But for all of her jewels and mansions, Queen Elizabeth, all she really has is a lot of pomp and circumstance. Because around the end of the 17th century, the power of the monarchy increasingly gave way to parliamentary rule in the UK. So while Elizabeth might have the title of queen, she really has no authority over the British people. She doesn't make laws, she doesn't send down decrees, she doesn't have any real influence on the government at all. The British royalty has become merely figureheads, nothing more than an expensive distraction for British citizens and others who love royalty all around the world. Even though the power of monarchies have been diminished in this modern world, the people, our modern day people, just like in the days of Samuel, most often we demand to be led, to be minded by someone, like a president or a prime minister, or even a group of someones, like a parliament or a congress. Since time immemorial, we humans have sought to figure out the perfect way to organize ourselves into a society. There have been communal societies where each person takes responsibility for the good of the whole. There have been dictatorial societies where power gets vested in one person who will, more than likely, rule ruthlessly over their people. And then there's all these other societal structures in between. In today's Hebrew scriptures, we witness how this ancient society began their tradition of kings. They had kings because the people demanded to be ruled by a king. Now Samuel had presided over this succession of judges that had previously ruled the people, and they settled disputes. They used their power to try to keep society as fair and as just as possible. But now the people, they were tired of this kind of government. They trusted Samuel, but they didn't really trust his sons to keep up the good work. So they're like, give us a king. So instead of living together in this light of mindfulness where people took care of one another through an arbiter or a judge, they wanted to give up this communal form of power and move backwards into that darkness of being minded, of being dictated to. And this request, it upsets Samuel. He takes it personally. But the Holy says, no, you didn't do anything wrong. The people are not rejecting you and your successful line of judges. Instead, this is very parallel to A Course in Miracles, where we had this tiny mad idea that we're all separate. And so we separated from God. And so Samuel says, it's not about you. They're not separating from you, Samuel. They're separating from me. They don't want me to be their king anymore. And that's how we ended up here. That's how the ego said, I want a king. I want to be the king over you. And we said, okay. And that's how we got here. That's how we got here. It's the tiny mad idea that our ego is the king and not God. And so God says, hey, Sam, you might want to warn them what it's going to be like when the ego is their king. And so the scriptures say that every king, this ego, it's going to be a king of pain. So the scriptures say, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50, and some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take. He will take. He will take. There is not one passage in 1 Samuel on what the king will give. Because kings are there to take. To take your land, to take your money, to take your harvest, to take your sons and your daughters, to take your joy, to take your peace, When we live in this darkness of being minded, we are in a state of constantly giving to the entity that minds us. We give our money, we give our time, we give our talent, even our precious children, to the machines of war. Whatever else we have set up to mind us, it takes, but it never gives. And it would be easy to, start a rant against our own form of government here in the United States, but just as the Hebrew people learned, all forms of human governments can be a source of corruption. We start out with good intentions. Government is really a good intention. We can't do these things individually, so let's pool our resources so we can do things that are bigger than ourselves. And in many ways, it has worked well. Roads are built. Railroads get built. Forms of commerce become easier and easier. We fund a militia to protect us from outside threats. We use our money to fund education and provide assistance to those who may have less than others. We come up with programs that help people get ahead and operate a justice system to enforce the laws of our particular society. Government isn't bad, but it's only as good as the people who are involved. And power can inevitably corrupt even the best human being in the world. So being minded by this kind of government, it's a risk that we have, as societies, we've decided to take that risk, for better or worse. And Samuel tried to warn his people and still warns us today that whenever we put a king in charge of our lives, whether it's a government, a relationship, a job, a bank account, a sporty new car, an ego, that king might bring us joy for a little while, but all kings will inevitably bring us nothing but pain. And in those moments, we will find that being minded often means we have cut ourselves off from relationship with the holy. Our reading from A Course in Miracles calls us back to this mindful state of unity with the holy. I rule my mind, this lesson says, which I alone must rule. I have a kingdom I must rule. But the ego prefers to be the ruler. And because it's so demanding, the Course says we often get confused about who's really in charge here. At times we don't feel like we rule our minds at all. Like today's reading says, it seems to triumph over me and tell me what to think and what to do and feel, and yet it has been given me to serve whatever purpose I perceive in it. The Course reminds us that though our minds are not really the king of anything, they are here to serve. And when we can realize that our mind should be in service to our higher divine self, then we remember who we are. We are the light of the world, and we are here to do the will of God. Now, everybody says, I'm going to do the will of God. What does that mean? We've talked about what it means to do the will of God. Remember, will is thought, and God is love. So we do the will of God when our minds are always in the service of love. Whether we're thinking loving thoughts, directing our hands to reach out to others with love, and our tongues to speak words of love into the world. Our mind, though, it doesn't like that. It is afraid when we start doing that because it thinks we're launching a coup to topple it from the throne. And we are. So he gets to work convincing us that all this bunch of New Age gobbledygook and spiritual bypass hooey is just crazy. And that's the worst thing that it can think of to tell us to keep it under its rule, is that we're crazy. You're crazy to believe all that stuff. But if we're crazy to think that way, we're in good company. Breathe deep. In our Jesus story, we find our guy in a familiar setting. He is surrounded by a crowd, but this is no normal crowd. They're gathered around Jesus' home in Nazareth, and Jesus is trying to get some rest. He's been out traveling the countryside and preaching to large crowds and healing everybody along the way. Instead, this mob decides to come over because they've heard about Jesus. I mean, he's home, remember? A prophet is never recognized in his hometown. So he's at home. These are the people who have known little Jesus running around cursing fig trees or whatever. That Jesus, he cursed my fig tree. It's never been the same since. So they have a different opinion of Jesus, right? And so they've heard about all of these great things that he's been doing out there, and they think he's nuts. Jesus is as crazy as a bedbug. He has gone out of his mind, they said. And they got so concerned, they rang up the scribes in Jerusalem those guys who were in charge of minding the affairs of the Jewish people, and they called them to Nazareth, and they got Jesus' family, who are his ultimate minders in this society, and they called them all to the house. Because Jesus was doing all this crazy stuff, like healing people and preaching about love and mercy and forgiveness, he was bringing shame to his family. And that was crazy. And this is not an instance of people flocking to Jesus to hear his message. No, this is an intervention. They accused Jesus of being in league with Satan, Beelzebub. It's easy to see why people thought Jesus was out of his mind. I mean, he was preaching against the very society of minders that his kinsmen had constructed to make them feel safe and secure. It's true that the Jews dreamed of a world where God's law ruled. They truly wanted a Messiah to be raised up and to revolutionize their political world and get rid of these Roman minders and bring back a kingly system of the rule that Samuel had given them. And they thought only a Messiah, God's king and ruler, could do that. Jesus, though, he wasn't acting like a Messiah was supposed to act like. He kept talking this crazy talk that the kingdom of God isn't out here in a political system, no matter how fair and equitable it is. Instead, Jesus kept preaching that the kingdom of God is in here. It's only within ourselves, in that higher divine part that does not need an outside minder, but instead only needs the mindfulness that unites us with the holy and with one another. Crazy, right? Sounds crazy. It still sounds crazy today. That it's all within you? Are you crazy? It's a mess in there. Well, of course it is. You're letting the ego rule. Get it off the throne. Even we progressive spiritual types, though, we still yearn for a fairer system of outside minders. We want a government made up of good people with limited corruption and maximum benefit for most of us. And we dream of that, and there's nothing wrong with working for that in the world. But to move out of the darkness of being minded ultimately means that we have to break free from all earthly authority over us and become mindful, which is a state where we so thoroughly realize our unity with God and everything else in creation that all we want to do is love it. All we want to do is take care of it. All we want to do is to see it thrive. And this is the place where we realize, at the deepest level, that we are all family. We are all one. That's crazy, right? So how do you move from this darkness of being minded to the light of mindfulness? I mean, it's one thing for Jesus to do it. We go, yeah, well, that was Jesus. We ain't Jesus. But you know what? We are Jesus. We are all the Christ. We all have the ability to move out of our need to be minded and into this oneness with the world that he attained. We can treat our ego like Queen Elizabeth and make its rule over our lives ceremonial, a figurehead with no real power over us. And we do that because we have something very important in common with Jesus. We are all what life coach Martha Beck calls wayfinders. Now, she defines a wayfinder as people who feel an internal call to heal any authentic part of the world, beginning with their own true nature. A wayfinder is someone who feels an internal call, realize the kingdom is in here, to heal any authentic part of the world, any inauthentic part of the world, beginning with their own true nature. So you're called to heal the world, beginning with healing on the inside. And this describes Jesus and his ministry perfectly. He was all about healing, returning people to their higher divine selves and healing his own human and divine nature. And Beck says the best way to embody our wayfinding nature and experience that oneness is what she calls dropping into wordlessness. Because language, it's symbols of symbols of symbols. Language only means something because we give it meaning. And so when we drop into wordlessness, that silence, we abandon the language that only further confuses us and makes us feel insecure and disconnected. And it may sound contradictory because Jesus did a lot of talking during his ministry, apparently. But observe how Jesus talked. He spoke in parables. He spoke in stories that so confused everyone around him. They were rendered speechless. That's what made Jesus such a powerful wayfinder. He knew how to use language to instantly connect people with that wordless and silent world of the holy, that place of exquisite silence where we realize we have far more in common with one another than we ever have differences. In this wordless world, we stop judging. We stop labeling things as good or bad or ugly or even beautiful or wonderful or recalcitrant. And we can feel that ultimate connection not just to the holy, but to everything and everyone, the sun, the moon, the stars, the lions, the giraffes, the leopards, the snakes, and their kin, the politicians. In this place of wordlessness, we feel at one, not just with our family or our loved ones, but with strangers and even people we perceive as enemies. It is this state of holy wordlessness where all barriers disappear and we understand how deeply we rely upon one another if we are going to be individuals at all. We see our interconnectedness. That's crazy, right? That's crazy. And Jesus' family thought so. They came to his house to plead with him to give up this crazy notion that human beings can live any way other than a society that is minded. But this passage makes it seem like Jesus rejects his family, but it's far from what he does. Instead, he says, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And he points to those sitting around him. Who are here? Here are my mother. Here's my mother. Here's my brother. Here's my sister. Whoever does the will of God, he says, is my brother and my sister and my mother. Now remember, he's saying this largely to a crowd that came to conduct an intervention to get him to stop what he was doing. And instead of rejecting his family and those people, he simply draws the circle bigger and includes all of them. Because when they realize their oneness, they too will move from the tyranny of being minded by their ego into the light of mindfulness, ruled by our higher divine self. But how do we do that? Well, Jesus tells us quite clearly what the Course would repeat thousands of years ago. Whoever does the will of God is my family. And what did we say is the will of God? Will is our thought. God is love. The Course invites us to dethrone the ego, that king of pain, and be ruled by nothing but love, by praying. Holy One, my mind is open to your thoughts and closed today to every thought but yours. I rule my mind, and I offer it to you. Jubilants, when love rules our thoughts and our actions, then we can drop into that wordless wonder of our unity with God and with one another. We don't have to say anything to feel that unity. And sometimes when we say things like, "I'm really feeling at one with you right now," people think we're crazy. So perhaps it's best not to say it. Feel it. Because if you feel it in that level of spirit, whoever you're with will feel it too, whether they are conscious of it or not. You meet them in that place of spirit, that wordless place where we are one. And when you get into that state of mind, where love is your only ruler, people might think you're a bit cuckoo. And so when they call you crazy, jubilants, and they will, all you need to say is, "Welcome to the family."